The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Riverside County Courthouse. It was just another Tuesday in what seemed like an endless stream of ordinary days. People hurried up and down the marble steps, some clutching papers nervously, others walking with the confident stride of those who knew their way around the legal system. Inside courtroom 3B, Judge William Crawford sat behind his imposing wooden bench, his black robe making him look even more stern than usual. At 58 years old, Crawford had been presiding over cases in this very courtroom for nearly 15 years. His gray hair was always perfectly combed, his face rarely showed any emotion, and his reputation for being tough on defendants was well known throughout the county. The morning session had been typical: a few traffic violations, a domestic dispute, and a small claims case that dragged on longer than it should have. Crawford glanced at his watch and noticed it was almost time for the lunch break. The courtroom was about half full, with the usual mix of lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and a few curious observers who had wandered in to watch the proceedings. That's when he noticed him. Sitting in the back row, third seat from the left, was a black man who looked to be in his late 40s. He was wearing a simple pair of dark jeans, a light blue button-down shirt that had seen better days, and worn sneakers that had clearly walked many miles. Next to him on the bench sat an old leather briefcase, scuffed and weathered like it had been through countless journeys. The man sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, watching the proceedings with what appeared to be genuine interest. He wasn't taking notes like some of the law students who occasionally visited. He wasn't fidgeting or checking his phone like many of the people waiting for their cases to be called. He was simply observing, his dark eyes taking in every detail of what was happening in the courtroom. Judge Crawford found this irritating for reasons he couldn't quite put into words. There was something about the man's calm demeanor that rubbed him the wrong way. Who was he? Why was he here? And more importantly, why wasn't he dressed appropriately for a courtroom appearance? Crawford had very specific ideas about how people should behave in his courtroom. Respect for the institution, proper attire, and deference to authority were not just preferences in his mind. They were requirements. He had spent years building what he considered to be the most well-run courtroom in the county, and he wasn't about to let some random person disrupt that order. The judge's attention was drawn back to the case at hand when the prosecutor began questioning a witness. But every few minutes his eyes would drift back to the man in the casual clothes. Something about him just didn't sit right with Crawford. He looked too comfortable, too at ease in a place where most people felt nervous or intimidated. As the morning wore on, more people filtered in and out of the courtroom. Some were called for their cases. Others left when they realized they were in the wrong place. But the man in the back row remained, seemingly content to watch the legal system in action. During a brief recess while the court reporter changed her paper, Judge Crawford decided he had seen enough. He couldn't concentrate on the cases with this distraction sitting in his courtroom. If the man was waiting for his case to be called, he needed to know that his attire was completely unacceptable. And if he was just here to observe, well, maybe it was time for him to observe from somewhere else. Crawford stepped down from his bench, something he rarely did during court sessions. The sound of his dress shoes clicking against the polished floor echoed through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Conversations stopped, heads turned, and everyone watched as the judge made his way toward the back of the room. The man in the casual clothes looked up as Crawford approached, but his expression remained neutral and respectful. There was no sign of panic or fear in his eyes, which only added to the judge's growing irritation. In Crawford's experience, people usually showed some sign of nervousness when a judge approached them directly. "Excuse me," Crawford said, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Are you here for the afternoon docket?" The man looked up calmly and replied, "No, Your Honor. I'm just observing today's proceedings." Crawford's eyebrows furrowed. The man's voice was educated, articulate, and completely composed. This wasn't what the judge had expected, and it threw him off balance for just a moment. But he quickly recovered, his irritation now mixed with a growing sense of indignation. "Observing?" Crawford repeated, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Well, I hope you're taking notes on proper courtroom behavior, because your appearance here today is completely inappropriate." The man remained seated, his hands still folded calmly in his lap. "I apologize if my presence has been disruptive in any way, Your Honor. That certainly wasn't my intention." But Crawford was just getting started. The man's polite response only seemed to fuel his anger rather than calm it. Disruptive? You think this is about being disruptive? This is about respect. Respect for the law, respect for this institution, and respect for the people who work hard to maintain order in our society. The courtroom had grown completely silent now. The handful of lawyers present exchanged uncomfortable glances. The court reporter's hands hovered over her keyboard, unsure whether she should be recording this unusual interaction. Even the bailiff looked uncertain about what he should do. Crawford's voice grew louder as he continued his lecture. When you come into my courtroom dressed like you're heading to a barbecue, you're sending a message. You're saying that you don't think this place deserves your best effort. You're saying that the law doesn't matter enough for you to put on proper clothes. The man listened without interrupting, his expression remaining respectful but unreadable. This only seemed to anger Crawford further. He had expected some kind of reaction, an apology, an explanation, maybe even some defiance that he could use to justify removing the man from his courtroom. Instead, he got quiet dignity, which somehow felt like the worst response possible. I've been on this bench for 15 years, Crawford continued, his voice now carrying throughout the entire courtroom, and I've seen it all. I've seen people who think they can walk in here and demand respect without earning it. I've seen people who think the rules don't apply to them, and I'm tired of it. The man finally spoke again, his voice still calm and measured. Your Honor, I understand your concerns about proper courtroom decorum. I simply came here today to observe the proceedings, as is my right as a citizen. Crawford's face was beginning to turn red now. The man's continued composure was infuriating him in ways he couldn't fully understand. You're right. Let me tell you something about rights. Rights come with responsibilities. And your responsibility when you enter my courtroom is to show proper respect. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Several people in the gallery were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. The court clerk kept glancing toward the door as if considering whether she should call for additional security. As Crawford prepared to escalate the situation further, he had no idea that his next words would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. He was so focused on what he saw as a challenge to his authority that he completely missed the significance of the weathered briefcase, sitting quietly beside the man he was confronting. In that briefcase were documents that would soon turn his world upside down. Judge. Crawford's face had turned a deep shade of red as he stood over the quietly seated man. The morning's frustration had built to a boiling point, and he could feel every eye in the courtroom watching this unprecedented confrontation. But instead of stepping back and returning to his bench, Crawford made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Stand up when I'm talking to you, Crawford commanded, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. The man slowly rose from his seat, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the increasingly hostile situation. He was taller than Crawford had expected, probably around 6 feet with broad shoulders and the kind of presence that commanded respect in any room. But the judge was too angry to notice these details. What's your name? Crawford demanded. David Johnson, the man replied simply. Crawford's eyes narrowed. Something about the way David answered bothered him. There was no stammering, no visible fear, no sign of the intimidation that Crawford was used to seeing when he confronted people in his courtroom. This calm confidence only fueled his anger further. Well, Mr. Johnson, let me explain something to you about how things work in my courtroom, Crawford began, his voice growing louder with each word. This isn't some community center where you can just wander in wearing whatever you feel like wearing. This is a court of law, and it demands respect. David nodded respectfully. I understand, Your Honor, but Crawford wasn't finished. Not even close. The polite responses were making him feel like his authority was being challenged in some subtle way that he couldn't quite define. In his mind, this man should have been apologizing profusely, maybe even begging to stay. Instead, he was standing there like he belonged in the courtroom as much as anyone else. I don't think you do understand, Crawford shot back. Because if you understood, you would have had the common sense to dress appropriately. You would have shown up here looking like you take this place seriously. The courtroom was now completely silent except for the judge's increasingly loud voice. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving over her keyboard. The bailiff stood uncertainly near the door, unsure whether this situation required his intervention. Several people in the gallery were looking down at their hands, uncomfortable with witnessing what was clearly becoming an abuse of power. Crawford turned away from David and addressed the entire courtroom, using him as an example for everyone present. "This is exactly what's wrong with our society today," he announced, gesturing toward David. "People think they can just show up anywhere, looking any way they want, and demand the same treatment as those who have earned it." David remained standing silently, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged. His weathered briefcase sat on the bench beside where he had been sitting, seemingly forgotten in the chaos of the moment. "Your Honor," David said quietly, "I meant no disrespect by my presence here today." Crawford whirled around to face him again. "Disrespect? You want to talk about disrespect? The disrespect is walking into my courtroom looking like you're about to mow someone's lawn. The disrespect is thinking that your comfort is more important than the dignity of this institution." The judge's voice was now carrying throughout the entire courthouse. People in the hallway outside had stopped their conversations to listen to the commotion coming from courtroom 3B. Court clerks from other departments were peeking through the doorway, trying to figure out what was happening. Crawford was warming up to his subject now, feeding off his own anger and the attention he was receiving. "I've been a judge in this county for 15 years, and I've seen this attitude before. People who think the rules don't apply to them. People who think they can waltz in here and demand respect without earning it." He paused for a moment, looking around the courtroom to make sure everyone was listening. The power he felt in that moment was intoxicating. Here he was, teaching everyone a lesson about proper behavior and respect for authority. This was exactly the kind of strong leadership that the community needed. "Let me tell you something about respect," Crawford continued, pointing his finger at David. "Respect is earned through actions. It's earned by showing up prepared, dressed appropriately, and conducting yourself with dignity. It's not something you're just entitled to because you walked through that door." David's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown during the entire confrontation, but he still said nothing, which only served to anger Crawford further. "I want you to look around this courtroom," Crawford commanded. "Look at the lawyers who came here today. Look at their suits, their ties, their professional appearance. That's what respect looks like. That's what taking this place seriously looks like." Crawford was now pacing back and forth in front of David, working himself into an even greater frenzy. "But you couldn't be bothered to put on decent clothes. You couldn't be bothered to show this institution the respect it deserves. And then you have the nerve to sit there like you belong here." The bailiff finally stepped forward, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. "Your Honor, should I—" "Yes," Crawford interrupted without even looking at him. "I want this man removed from my courtroom immediately, and I want him to understand that he's not welcome back here until he learns how to dress and behave appropriately." David's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but his voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I believe I have the right to observe public court proceedings." Crawford's face turned an even deeper shade of red. The fact that this man was now quoting legal principles to him was the final straw. "Rights? You want to lecture me about rights? Let me tell you about contempt of court, Mr. Johnson. Let me tell you about what happens when people disrupt my courtroom and challenge my authority." The judge turned to the bailiff. "Officer Rodriguez, escort this gentleman out of my courtroom immediately. And if he resists or causes any further disruption, you have my permission to arrest him for contempt." As the bailiff approached David, the briefcase that had been sitting quietly on the bench suddenly became relevant. In the commotion of standing up in the bailiff's approach, David's arm bumped against it, sending it tumbling to the floor. The old leather case hit the ground with a thud, and its worn clasp gave way, spilling papers across the polished courtroom floor. Documents scattered in every direction. Official-looking papers with government letterheads, manila folders with important-looking labels, and what appeared to be photographs spread across the floor like leaves in the wind. David immediately dropped to his knees to gather the papers, but the bailiff was already reaching for his arm. "Leave it," Crawford commanded from above. "Whatever mess you've made, you can clean it up outside." "Officer Rodriguez, get him out of here now!" The courtroom erupted in a flurry of activity as the bailiff began escorting David toward the door. People in the gallery craned their necks to see what was happening. The court reporter finally started typing again, documenting what would later become the most important transcript of Crawford's career. As David was led away, still trying to gather his scattered papers, Crawford returned to his bench feeling vindicated and powerful. He had shown everyone in that courtroom what happened when people didn't respect his authority. He had made an example that wouldn't soon be forgotten. But Judge Crawford had no idea that in his rush to humiliate and remove David Johnson, he had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. Among those scattered papers were documents that would soon expose him for exactly what he was. And the man he had just thrown out of his courtroom was about to become his worst nightmare. The irony was almost perfect. In his desperate attempt to maintain his power and authority, Crawford had just handed over the evidence that would destroy both forever. The courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence after David Johnson was escorted out. Judge Crawford returned to his bench, adjusting his robe and trying to regain his composure, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The dozen or so people remaining in the gallery sat frozen, unsure whether they should stay or leave after witnessing such an extraordinary outburst from the judge. Near the back of the courtroom, a young woman named Lisa Chen sat staring at the scattered papers that still littered the floor where David's briefcase had fallen. As a court clerk who had been working in the building for 3 years, she had seen her share of dramatic moments, but nothing quite like what had just unfolded. Something about those papers on the floor was bothering her. Crawford banged his gavel sharply. "Court will resume in 15 minutes, he announced, his voice still carrying traces of anger. "Everyone except court personnel needs to clear the courtroom during recess." As people began filing out, Lisa noticed that no one was paying attention to the documents still scattered across the floor. The bailiff was busy dealing with other matters. The judge had disappeared into his chambers, and the cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until after court ended for the day. Someone needed to gather those papers before they got lost or damaged. Lisa walked over to where the papers had fallen and began carefully collecting them. As she picked up the first few sheets, her eyes caught sight of an official seal that made her heart skip a beat. The header read, "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Internal Affairs Division," in bold letters across the top of the page. Her hands trembling slightly, Lisa picked up another document. This one bore the letterhead of the State Judicial Commission, and the words "Confidential Investigation" were stamped in red across the top. She glanced around quickly to make sure no one was watching, then continued gathering the scattered papers. The third document she picked up nearly made her drop everything. It was a detailed report titled, "Pattern of Discriminatory Behavior. Judge William Crawford, Riverside County Superior Court." The report was dated just 2 weeks earlier, and it contained a long list of complaints, incident reports, and what appeared to be surveillance notes. Lisa's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. David Johnson wasn't just some random observer who had wandered into the courtroom. He was clearly some kind of investigator, and Judge Crawford had just provided him with exactly the kind of evidence that this investigation was apparently looking for. She continued collecting papers, each one more damaging than the last. There were copies of complaints filed against Crawford by attorneys, defendants, and even other court personnel. There were transcripts of previous hearings where Crawford had made inappropriate comments. There were photographs that appeared to have been taken from hidden cameras in the courtroom. One document that particularly caught her attention was a thick folder labeled "Case File, Analysis Sentencing Disparities." Inside were charts and graphs showing how Crawford's sentences varied dramatically based on the race and socioeconomic status of defendants. The patterns were so clear and so obvious that even someone without legal training could see the bias. Lisa realized she was holding explosive evidence of systematic discrimination and abuse of power. But she also realized that she was in an incredibly dangerous position. If Judge Crawford discovered that she had seen these documents, her career would be over. If she tried to hide them or destroy them, she could face serious criminal charges. But if she did nothing, Crawford would continue to destroy lives from his position of power. As she gathered the last few papers, Lisa noticed footsteps approaching. She quickly stuffed the documents into a manila envelope she found among the scattered items and stood up just as Officer Rodriguez returned to the courtroom. "Everything okay, Lisa?" he asked, noticing her flushed appearance. "Just cleaning up the mess from earlier," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "That man dropped his briefcase when you were escorting him out." Rodriguez nodded. Judge Crawford was pretty worked up about that guy. Never seen him get that angry before. He paused for a moment, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I thought he went a little overboard. The guy wasn't really causing any trouble." Lisa nodded, clutching the envelope of documents against her chest. "What happened to him?" "The man who was removed. He's probably long gone by now, Rodriguez replied. Judge told me to make sure he understood he wasn't welcome back here. After Rodriguez left, Lisa sat alone in the empty courtroom, staring at the envelope in her hands. She knew that David Johnson would need these documents back, but she had no idea how to contact him. She also knew that she couldn't just leave them lying around where Crawford might find them. Looking at her watch, she realized that court would resume in just a few minutes. She made a quick decision and hurried to her small office down the hall, where she carefully placed the envelope in her locked desk drawer. She would figure out what to do with the documents later, but for now they needed to be somewhere safe. When court resumed, Judge Crawford seemed to have regained his composure, but Lisa could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He clearly believed that he had handled the situation perfectly, that he had shown everyone in his courtroom what happened to people who didn't respect his authority. He had no idea that his moment of triumph had actually been his downfall. Throughout the afternoon session, Lisa found it almost impossible to concentrate on her work. Every time she looked at Crawford, she thought about the documents in her desk drawer. She knew things about him now that could end his career and possibly land him in prison. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. As the day wore on, Lisa began to piece together what she thought had happened. David Johnson was clearly an undercover investigator who had been studying Crawford's behavior for months, maybe even years. The judge's racist outburst had been exactly the kind of evidence that Johnson needed to complete his investigation. Crawford had essentially convicted himself in front of a room full of witnesses. The irony wasn't lost on Lisa. Crawford's own prejudices and inability to control his temper had led him to attack the very person who was investigating him. It was like a criminal confessing to a detective without realizing who he was talking to. Near the end of the day, as court was winding down, Lisa made another crucial decision. She couldn't just sit on this information and hope that David Johnson would somehow find his way back to retrieve his documents. She needed to take action, but she needed to be smart about it. Using her computer, Lisa began researching David Johnson and the agencies mentioned in the documents. It didn't take long for her to find a phone number for the FBI's Civil Rights Division. After several transfers and a lot of explaining, she finally reached someone who confirmed that there was indeed an ongoing investigation into judicial misconduct in Riverside County. "Ma'am," the federal agent on the phone said, "if you have documents related to this investigation, we need you to secure them immediately and contact our office first thing tomorrow morning. This is a matter of national importance." Lisa hung up the phone with her hands shaking. National importance. She was now part of something much bigger than she had imagined. Judge Crawford wasn't just a local problem. He was part of a larger pattern of corruption and discrimination that was being investigated at the highest levels of government. As she locked her office and prepared to leave for the day, Lisa saw Judge Crawford walking toward the parking garage. He was talking on his cell phone, laughing about something, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was about to come crashing down around him. Tomorrow would bring federal agents, internal affairs investigators, and quite possibly the end of William Crawford's career. And it had all started with a briefcase full of papers scattered across his own courtroom floor. Lisa Chen, a quiet court clerk who had just wanted to do her job and go home, had become the key witness in what would soon become one of the biggest judicial scandals in the county's history. The documents in her desk drawer would change everything, and there was no going back now. Judge Crawford arrived at his office the next morning feeling particularly good about himself. The previous day's confrontation had reinforced his belief that he was exactly the kind of strong leader the courthouse needed. He had shown everyone what happened when people didn't respect his authority, and word would spread quickly through the legal community about the consequences of inappropriate behavior in his courtroom. His secretary, Angela Torres, was already at her desk when he walked in, but something seemed different about her demeanor. She looked nervous, almost frightened, and she kept glancing toward his office door as if expecting someone to emerge from it. "Good morning, Angela," Crawford said cheerfully, hanging up his jacket. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Angela looked up at him with wide eyes.
"Judge Crawford, there are some people here to see you."
"They've been waiting in your office for about 20 minutes. Crawford's good mood faltered slightly. "People? What people?" "I don't have any appointments scheduled until 10 o'clock. "They said they were from the FBI and the State Judicial Commission," Angela replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They had badges and everything." I didn't know what else to do, so I let them wait in your office." The blood drained from Crawford's face. FBI, State Judicial Commission? His mind raced through various possibilities, none of them good. Had there been some kind of security threat? Was this about a case he had handled? Or was it something much worse? Crawford straightened his tie and tried to compose himself before walking into his office. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he opened the door. 3 people were seated in chairs arranged in a semicircle facing his desk. The first was a woman in her 40s wearing a dark blue suit with an FBI badge clearly visible on her jacket. The second was an older man in a gray suit with a State Judicial Commission identification card clipped to his shirt pocket. And sitting in the chair closest to Crawford's desk was David Johnson. But this wasn't the same David Johnson who had been humiliated and thrown out of Crawford's courtroom the day before. This David Johnson was wearing an expensive navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. His weathered briefcase had been replaced with a sleek leather portfolio, and there was a federal badge prominently displayed on his jacket. Crawford stood frozen in his doorway, his mouth hanging open as he tried to process what he was seeing. David Johnson looked up at him with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout yesterday's confrontation, but now there was something else in his eyes. It wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had been vindicated after a long and difficult investigation. "Good morning, Judge Crawford," said the woman with the FBI badge, standing up and extending her hand. "I'm Special Agent Patricia Williams with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. This is Inspector Robert Martinez from the State Judicial Commission, and I believe you've already met Investigator David Johnson." Crawford's hand trembled as he shook Agent Williams' hand. His legs felt weak, and he had to grip the edge of his desk to steady himself as he walked around to his chair. I don't understand." "What is this about?" David Johnson opened his portfolio and pulled out a thick folder. "Judge Crawford, my name is David Johnson, and I'm a special investigator with the Federal Civil Rights Division. For the past 8 months, I've been conducting an undercover investigation into allegations of systematic discrimination and civil rights violations in your courtroom." Crawford sank into his chair, feeling like the walls were closing in around him. "Investigation? What investigation? I don't know what you're talking about." Inspector Martinez spoke up for the first time. "Judge Crawford, we've received numerous complaints over the past 2 years alleging that you've engaged in a pattern of discriminatory behavior, particularly toward minority defendants and observers. Yesterday's incident was the final piece of evidence we needed to complete our investigation." "Yesterday's incident?" Crawford's voice was barely a whisper. The reality of what had happened was beginning to sink in. The man he had humiliated, the man he had thrown out of his courtroom for being inappropriately dressed, was a federal investigator who had been watching him for months. David Johnson reached into his portfolio again and pulled out a small digital recording device. "Judge Crawford, yesterday's confrontation was recorded by multiple surveillance devices that we had placed in your courtroom as part of this investigation. We have clear audio and video evidence of everything that was said and done." Crawford felt sick to his stomach. Everything he had said, every racist comment, every abuse of his judicial power had been recorded by federal agents. The very behavior that had made him feel powerful and in control had actually been destroying his life one word at a time. Agent Williams took over the conversation. "Judge Crawford, based on our investigation, we have documented evidence of civil rights violations, abuse of judicial authority, and a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning several years. The incident yesterday was simply the most egregious example of conduct that we've been tracking for quite some time." "But I was just maintaining order in my courtroom," Crawford protested weakly. That man was inappropriately dressed. He was being disrespectful. David Johnson leaned forward slightly. "Judge Crawford, I have a law degree from Harvard University. I spent 5 years as a federal prosecutor before joining the Civil Rights Division. I've investigated judicial misconduct cases in 12 different states. Yesterday I was dressed casually because I was conducting surveillance, not because I was disrespectful or unprepared." The weight of his mistake hit Crawford like a physical blow. He had attacked one of the most qualified legal professionals in the federal government, assuming that his casual clothes meant he was somehow less worthy of respect. His own prejudices had blinded him to the truth that was sitting right in front of him. Inspector Martinez opened his own folder and began reading from a prepared statement. Judge Crawford, based on the evidence collected during this investigation, the State Judicial Commission is immediately suspending you from all judicial duties pending a full disciplinary hearing. You are required to surrender your judicial credentials and remove yourself from all pending cases. Crawford's world was collapsing around him. 15 years of judicial service gone in an instant because he couldn't control his temper or his prejudices. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said desperately. "I've served this community faithfully for 15 years. I've never done anything illegal." Agent Williams pulled out another folder. "Judge Crawford, our investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic sentencing disparities based on race, inappropriate comments made to minority defendants, and a pattern of behavior that violates the civil rights of people who appear in your courtroom. What happened yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of discrimination." David Johnson stood up and walked over to Crawford's bookshelf, where the judge kept his law books and awards. "Judge Crawford, the irony of this situation isn't lost on me. Yesterday, you lectured me about respect for the law and respect for institutions. You told me that I didn't belong in your courtroom because of how I was dressed. But the truth is, you're the one who has spent years disrespecting the law and destroying the integrity of this institution." Crawford slumped in his chair, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened. His own arrogance and prejudice had led him to attack the very person who was investigating him. He had provided federal agents with exactly the evidence they needed to destroy his career, and he had done it in front of a room full of witnesses. "What happens now?" Crawford asked, his voice hollow and defeated. Agent Williams closed her folder and stood up. "Now you face the consequences of your actions, Judge Crawford. The federal investigation will continue, and depending on what we find, you may face criminal charges for civil rights violations. The State Judicial Commission will conduct their own hearings, and you'll most likely lose your position permanently." As the three investigators prepared to leave, David Johnson paused at the door and looked back at Crawford one more time. "Judge Crawford, yesterday you told me that respect is earned through actions. You were right about that. The difference is your actions have earned you the opposite of respect. They've earned you disgrace." Crawford sat alone in his office for a long time after they left, staring at the empty chairs where his accusers had been sitting. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built was gone. And the worst part was that he had done it to himself. One prejudiced decision at a time. 6 months later, the Riverside County Courthouse looked exactly the same from the outside, but everything inside had changed. The scandal involving former Judge William Crawford had sent shockwaves through the entire legal community, sparking reforms that would affect courtrooms across the state. David Johnson stood in the hallway outside courtroom 3B, now wearing his official federal investigator credentials openly. He was there for the final hearing in the Crawford case, but his mind wandered back to that Tuesday morning when everything had begun. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he had sat in the back row wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, quietly observing the proceedings while Crawford's prejudices slowly revealed themselves. The irony still amazed him. Crawford's own behavior had provided the perfect ending to an investigation that might have taken months longer to complete. In trying to humiliate David, the judge had actually humiliated himself in front of federal agents, court personnel, and a room full of witnesses. Lisa Chen, the court clerk who had gathered the scattered documents that day, walked up to David with a smile. Over the past 6 months, she had become a key witness in the federal case against Crawford, and her quick thinking had helped preserve crucial evidence that might otherwise have been lost. "Investigator Johnson," she said, extending her hand, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done. This place feels completely different now." David shook her hand warmly. "I should be thanking you, Lisa. Without your help that day, we might not have been able to build as strong a case. You showed real courage in a difficult situation." Lisa had indeed shown courage. After contacting the FBI that evening 6 months ago, she had spent weeks providing testimony, helping agents understand the inner workings of Crawford's courtroom, and identifying other potential witnesses. Her willingness to speak up had been crucial to the success of the investigation. The doors to courtroom 3B opened, and people began filing out after the final hearing. William Crawford emerged looking like a broken man. His expensive suits had been replaced with ill-fitting clothes from a discount store. His confident demeanor had been replaced with the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of someone who had lost everything. The final judgment had been devastating. Crawford had been permanently removed from the bench, stripped of his law license, and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for civil rights violations. The judge who had once lectured others about respect and following the law was now heading to prison for breaking both. But Crawford's downfall was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The video recording of his racist tirade had gone viral within days of being released, sparking national conversations about judicial accountability and bias in the court system. News outlets across the country had picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of institutional racism and abuse of power. David had testified before Congress about the need for better oversight of judicial conduct. His calm, professional demeanor during Crawford's attack had made him a compelling witness, and his credentials gave weight to his recommendations for reform. The contrast between his dignity under attack and Crawford's loss of control had become a powerful illustration of who truly deserved respect at the state judicial commission. Had implemented sweeping changes in response to the Crawford case. All judges were now required to undergo annual bias training. New oversight procedures had been put in place to investigate complaints more quickly and thoroughly. Hidden cameras and recording devices were being installed in courtrooms across the state to prevent future abuses. Most importantly, a new position had been created, Judicial Conduct Investigator, specifically designed to identify and address discriminatory behavior before it could destroy lives. David had been offered the job of heading up this new program, and he had accepted without hesitation. Standing in the courthouse hallway, David thought about all the defendants who had suffered under Crawford's biased rulings over the years. Many of them had received harsher sentences simply because of their race or economic status. Some had been treated with contempt and disrespect that had nothing to do with their actual crimes. The investigation had revealed dozens of cases where Crawford's prejudices had corrupted the justice system. But there was hope now. Several of Crawford's most problematic cases were being reviewed, and some defendants were having their sentences reduced or their convictions overturned entirely. The new oversight system was already identifying other problematic judges before their behavior could reach Crawford's level of abuse. Angela Torres, Crawford's former secretary, walked by and nodded respectfully to David. She had also testified in the case, describing years of inappropriate comments and behavior that she had witnessed but felt powerless to report. The investigation had given her and other court employees a voice they had never had before. "The whole atmosphere here is different now," she had told investigators. "People feel like they can speak up if they see something wrong. Before, everyone was afraid of Judge Crawford's temper. Now we know there are people watching out for us and for the people who come through these courtrooms." As David prepared to leave the courthouse, he reflected on the lessons of the Crawford case. The judge's downfall hadn't been caused by some elaborate federal sting operation or complex investigative technique. It had been caused by his own inability to see past his prejudices and treat all people with basic dignity and respect. Crawford had been so convinced of his own superiority that he couldn't imagine the casually dressed black man in his courtroom might be more educated, more accomplished, and more respectable than he was. That blindness had led him to provide federal investigators with perfect evidence of the very crimes they were investigating. The case had also shown the importance of ordinary people like Lisa Chen, who were willing to step up and do the right thing when they witnessed injustice. Without her quick thinking and courage, crucial evidence might have been lost, and Crawford might have continued his pattern of abuse for years to come. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor at the FBI. "Great work on the Crawford case. Ready for your next assignment?" He smiled as he typed back his response. "Always ready. Justice doesn't sleep." As he walked out of the Riverside County Courthouse for what might be the last time, David felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond just winning a case. The investigation had shown that the system could work when good people were willing to stand up for what was right. Crawford's prejudices had ultimately destroyed him, while David's dignity and professionalism had earned him the respect that Crawford had demanded but never deserved. The man who had been thrown out of courtroom 3B in jeans and sneakers was now leaving as a federal investigator whose work had helped reform the entire judicial system. It was a reminder that true respect isn't about what you wear or what title you hold. It's about how you treat other people and whether you have the courage to stand up for justice when it matters most. William Crawford had learned that lesson too late. But thanks to David Johnson's investigation and the courage of people like Lisa Chen, future judges would learn it before they had the chance to destroy lives and careers with their prejudices. The system wasn't perfect, but it was getting better, one courtroom at a time.